Hello and welcome to episode 192 of Page One, the Writers' Podcast. I'm Marco, and this week you're back, Tarek.
I am back.
I know people were worried last week.
How many letters did we get in that?
They were worried that you would return this week, and you've disappointed them.
Very good. All those people. Sorry to disappoint you, but I am actually returning to the podcast.
Yes. Thanks for joining us on the podcast where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. But those of you that have been following our recent episodes will know that these are a special series of episodes where we're speaking not to writers, but to those people that deal with the book once it's written, agents, editors, and so on. And we've had a run of great agents. And today we have more agents, but somewhat different from the agents that we've been speaking to before.
That's right. This week we're chatting with a duology of agents, Norah Perkins and Becky Brown. They work for Curtis Brown. I don't believe there's a relation there to the
No,
agency.
I don't.
But they're a pair of agents who work in the heritage section of Curtis Brown. And what that means for those that might not know is essentially they deal with the estates of authors who have passed away. So older authors, for 10 years to 100 years, it's a variety of agents, a variety of authors and books and clients. And it's interesting because we haven't talked to a pair of agents like this before. And there were also fresh off winning Literary Agent of the Year at the British Book Awards the day before, which I think was also the first time both a heritage author had won that award and also a pair of agents, won that award.
I think that's right. And I think Becky and Norah actually sort of founded the heritage section at Curtis Brown to sort of, because often as we talk about with them, you'll have authors that are who die, but they will be republished. But it's often, or at least until recently, it was certain classics, if you like, in inverted commas, that would get republished. But I think what our chat brings out with Becky and Norah is that every author should be thinking about their rights. It's not always a nice thing to think about, dying. But, if you've written something and it's published, then it has some worth, and you should think about what you want to happen to those rights afterwards. And we chat to them about that. We chat to them about how they pick and find what to publish, what from the backlist to publish, almost working like literary detectives in a way to try and source things.
It's a job I hadn't really considered much before, and it is a sense of going through an author's backlist and saying, what books do we think would be relevant now? What do you think would be good? Showing there's so many. I think they might say at some point, I think that there's so many authors that people know, and they know one or two books of them that they've maybe read or heard of, and yet that author may have written 10, 20, 30 books, and so many of them have just been lost. So it's quite, I guess it's a nice way to try and bring some of these books that may have been lost to time back to the public forefront again.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a bit of a different chat, but it's a really interesting one. So we'll get straight into it now. And we will be back next week with a continuation of this series of episodes, but not an agent, an editor next week. Yes.
How exciting.
But for now, we will get straight to the interview.
On with the podcast.
Did you always want to work in publishing? What was that always a goal from when you were younger?
Great question. I don't think that I had understood when I grew up. My kind of that if you love books, which I think we probably both did, but I remember that was all I ever did as a kid. But I knew about, like, there were two possibilities. You could be a writer, or you could be an academic of some kind. And I think we were a family obsessed with books. My dad had been a lecturer, university lecturer, and none of us had been publishers. We were readers and writers and lecturers and academics. And the idea that there was a professional trade attached to books had absolutely never crossed my mind. Probably not until I was almost in my mid-20s, if I'm honest. I'm a Canadian. It's a slightly different system. Everybody gets started a little bit later over there. It always terrifies me that you've got people coming out of university and knowing exactly what they're going to do and going straight into their industry, because it took me a good 10 years to work it out. So it came to me late that there was a trade, and I think I wish I could have known, maybe a bit earlier, that there was this industry where that were for readers, for people who love books, but also was not an academic setting, because I quickly realized that academic world was not going to be my path forward. But did you?
I wanted to be a marine biologist when I was little.
Nice.
I don't know what
the far-flung parts of the world and the warm sea.
I don't know. Do you know, I don't really like swimming, and I didn't really enjoy science, so I'm actually not enormously sure. Yeah, I think it was probably a dolphin thing or something. And I did my work experience in a dog kennels, and I actually was bitten by an Alsatian, which is that paid to being a vet. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I was a voracious reader from when I was tiny. I ruined my eyesight because I used to read by the burglar light at night and dangle my dressing gown cable out the window and all read by the moon. But it wasn't kind of, I think, until I was probably 15 or 16 that I realized I was much better at books than at anything else. That they brought me a kind of joy that other things didn't. And then I did what I imagine is a pretty standard path for British people in publishing. I did an English literature degree. And there, I don't actually think I knew about agents until after that, though. My perception was very like yours, writers, and by that point, publishers, editors, and I wanted to be an editor.
So how was it that you ended up in the agenting world then? What was that step?
Well, I think we kind of came from different worlds. I mean, I again, I'll go back to Canada. It's a huge country with some wonderful, vibrant publishing history, but it's in tiny enclaves in a handful of cities very far away from each other. And I grew up on the West Coast, and so when I finally worked out that publishing was what I wanted to do, I did some internships at some really lovely local Vancouver presses that did like cookery books and local walking guides, and realized quite swiftly that I needed to find a way to kind of get the next leg into the industry, how I was going to sort of leverage my way into or sort of jimmy open the door to something that felt like very far away in Toronto. That's where the kind of major English language publishing happens. That's less now, but it is a bit more diverse and regional now, but certainly, 20 years ago, that's how it felt. And so I went and did a master's in publishing, which I think was helpful because it got you an internship at the end of it. So that was part of the course, and that was how I kind of got into a slightly more traditional publishing world. And I think they actually, part of the joy of that was they did actually talk you through all the aspects of the industry, and agenting was part of that. But I never, again, I was like you, it was definitely editorial, which I think is so traditional. Again, an English degree, and editing is the kind of closest thing you can imagine to hands-on work, which is wild because actually agenting is the most hands-on thing you can do. Being an agent is,
even on a text level,
absolutely.
most agents are way more engaged in actual kind of shaping.
Yeah.
But what you would call your kind of bread and butter editing than a lot of editors are. So,
absolutely. And I mean, as an agent, you see, like, you're often the first person in the world to have read a writer's book. And that is the most honor you can have. And also just an incredibly intimate relationship with that writing process. And so I think possibly that wasn't played up enough, because in a way, I think, but the combination of really like the approach to raw talent and the first moment of seeing a book and the work an agent can do on it creatively and with that writer. And also, just the sort of independence that an agent has. We're so taste driven, and we don't exist without our taste. So nobody tells you what you can or can't take on. It's not like a publishing company where they say, we'll have a giant, acquisitions meeting, and then somebody from marketing says, I don't see a market for it, so that's too bad, go away. I mean,
you learn that bit the hard way when you send it out and no one buys
totally.
it.
But you still trust your instinct, and you can do it the next week. Okay, you didn't sell that one, but you're going to go do it all over again, because you're seeing this talent and seeing the potential, and nobody says you can't do that. So it's a play, and I think that's something I think we should all talk to students about more, actually. Anyways, that was a long answer.
It was, but informative.
Your turn.
I had an equally kind of convoluted way in. I, after university, worked for an antiquarian book dealer as a cataloguing assistant. So these great big boxes of kind of books that could be anything from kind of 400 years old to 20 years old would come in, and it was my job to research them, look for what were they worth, what was similar ones selling for, what if the condition was better or worse, or what would happen to the price, which was a really, I think, enough of a kind of book adjacent thing to help me kind of get my first proper publishing internship, which was at a literary agency, working with estates. So I think the oldness of the books was probably helpful in that regard. I did have a sort of 6-week interim period where I was an unpaid intern for the World of Fine Wine magazine, and I really hated wine. I really thought wine tasted disgusting. So again, not a great job.
I feel the evidence of last night might
yeah,
you have changed your mind.
I'm on the champagne nowadays, but so I kind of came in quite an odd way, and then was an editorial assistant for a while for Bloomsbury and their Whitaker's Almanac book. I guess the whole imprint is one book, and again that's like very sort of not quite real publishing, before I ended up back in an agency, and I've been working in agencies pretty much ever since.
So now obviously you've ended up working in the heritage section of Curtis Brown, and for those that don't know what the heritage section does, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what your day-to-day job is and how it compares to, I guess, what people would normally think of as agents, and what the difference is.
Absolutely. Do you want to start?
Yeah. So the sort of fundamental distinction between our work and basically any other agent's work is that all of our clients are dead. They are literary estates rather than living writers. So it's actually very interesting what impact that has on your work, because so much of publishing depends on the author. The author drives publicity for their book. The author also continues to write books, which helps to sell their backlist. Every time you've got a new book out, you can talk about your old books and you keep it in the public consciousness. And so really a lot of what we do is kind of try to be that author figure, not in a kind of wig and beard sort of sense, but in a we try to provide the forward momentum that can drop away once someone has died.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's because you're looking at a whole body of work, not just the next thing. Our colleagues are brilliant, and they when they go out with a book, that is the thing they're going out with. And we're faced with there is no natural, here's the next book you must read. We actually have to, we have anywhere from 10 to 70 books on an author's list, because depending on what kind of book you're writing or how prolific you were, it can be an enormous number of titles. And it's about how do you, I think we try very hard to not see it as, well, we represent all of Iris Murdoch's books, is there anything you like here? We have to go back. We said, I think the only way to do it is to treat each of those books as though it was the book that you're, the sort of front list. So here's what we love and are passionate about. So we do a huge amount of we don't read at all during our day jobs. I think you probably have a million editors and agents coming in to say exactly this. And I'm sure this is a message you've heard. Like, none of us have time to read during the day. We're doing all of the sort of support and communication. We're email machines at some level, and sort of like
contract negotiations,
exactly, sort of flag waving and cheerleading. All that stuff happens during our working day, and then we're also trying to read as many of our books as we can. I think so. Curtis Brown Heritage, for a sort of overarching view, we are most importantly 125 years old. Curtis Brown as a company is 125 years old this year, and Curtis Brown Heritage, which we co-founded, is it like 8 years ago now? 7 years ago?
I think it's 8 years ago.
It's been ages now. We co-founded that to celebrate the history of our company, the history of taste, of individual kind of like passion. We represent the books that agents across the decades have represented, who had different, agents have retired or died over the decades, and we've inherited many, almost all of those writers. So we represent people who were represented by Curtis Brown at the turn of the century, the last century, in the 1920s, all the way through up to the 1990s and 2000s, and obviously who died much more recently. So it is a kind of we represent hopefully the history of our company and of tastes throughout the decade, of readers' tastes, of agents' tastes, of our company kind of moving to sort of with the times. And so it has it's I'm not sure that's a day-to-day thing, but that's who we are. We represent. Oh yeah, I remember. So having said that, we represent about 4,500 books altogether,
At the last
100 at last count, about 150 writers, most of whom come from our history, but we're also building our list and future-proofing our list and taking on new literary estate clients, where they haven't had an active agent for a while, or where they're recently in a state, or however that works. And so thinking about how you couldn't possibly read 4,500 books and hand sell every one of them. So, but we do try to read deep into those lists, and the kind of, everybody knows The Sea by Iris Murdoch, but actually she wrote, 20 other wonderful novels. And so which of those are we going to read and talk about and be passionate about and hand sell and hand pitch? And that's the balance, is finding that. And what else do we do?
And also, I mean, a lot of it is not like myth busting is too dramatic, but it's very easy as the decades wear on for an author to be sort of almost diminished to their most famous work. And we are very lucky to look after AA Milne. And we don't have any problems getting people to ask us about Winnie the Pooh, but he actually wrote an extraordinary detective novel called The Red House Mystery that is a genuinely cracking golden age crime fiction. And that nothing happens with that unless we speak about it. And so you end up with these kind of where actually sometimes you're fighting the legacy in order to kind of get a better understanding of the writer. And
I mean, and one of the fun things that we do that is actually find people who are writing now, who are fans of those books. And so we think a lot about, I think the question we get asked a lot is like, why this book now? Why is this relevant now? And the amazing thing is that so many of them are utterly relevant, that the writers in past decades speak into the future. Writers are, storytellers by nature, are just, they're it's not just about the time that they're in right now. They're speaking to a much longer history ahead and behind it them. And so what the joy is often finding, living writers who are huge fans of A.A. Milne or Laurie Lee or, Margaret Kennedy, and sort of matchmaking with people who are living now, who become part of that voice. So that's another lovely way of kind of bringing things into the future and refinding the message. And it's, some things are, if we weren't looking at them, they would never be seen again. And I think, well, that's a big claim, but they might never be seen again. And so, that sense of, I mean, Becky's great triumph of the last couple of years was literally pulling out a slim novella from a Oxfam bookshop shelf and turning it into a kind of global publishing phenomenon. And if you hadn't pulled that out, it might, it's like sort of didn't even have a title on the spine. It was so slim, and you just sort of plucked it out and read it and realized what you had, and it was a lost masterpiece. And it's that sense of we're trying to turn over leaves or rocks and see what scuffles out from underneath them. That's really fun.
What was the lost novella? What was that?
It's called They by an amazing writer named Kay Dick, who was actually an extraordinarily central part of 20th century publishing. She was the first ever, I think, female publishing director of a publishing company. She edited George Orwell. She was a kind of incredibly distinct, striking, flamboyant figure who was right in the heart of kind of British literature and had just been entirely forgotten. And They was her penultimate piece of fiction. It was published to very little acclaim. One print run, fell out of print. And, it's this extraordinary dystopia where this kind of quite bucolic rural England is being sort of overrun by a mob called They, who are anti-individualist, anti-creativity. And I found it in 2020 when, it kind of felt like Trump was never going to leave office. And, and the pandemic was this terrifying, very new thing. And I think where we were all aware, maybe more so than we had been for perhaps the last half century, of how dangerous kind of uninterrogated group thought can be. It spoke, I think, in a way that it didn't speak in the late 1970s, and it was wonderful to see it kind of capture people's imagination and resonate again. And that's the very kind of, we don't get to do that sort of stuff that often, but when it happens, it's extremely special.
Do you obviously you're working with the estates, as you said, of authors that worked for Curtis Brown as well, but is part of your job then also almost like a literary detective work, if you like, and you'll come across something that hasn't been represented or picked up, and you find something that you think Israel
even on our own list.
But no, I mean, Cadic is a great example of that. It was just in a charity shop, and so we had to trace the estate, and we do a lot of. I sometimes think they must have like a special file on us at the UK probate office. Like, why do these women order so many wills? Like, there must be some sort of little red flag system, and they're like, well, why? Like, what are they doing? But yeah, that's. I mean,
it's a joy actually. We love doing it, and we love doing it. I mean, we also love. I mean, we've done crazy things. Sometimes it takes years to untangle where something comes from. And we had a lovely book publishing in the fall by a writer called Len Howard, who published 2 books back in the 50s about birds in her garden in Sussex. And she had been out of print for decades and decades, and they're just really kind of like amateur naturalism meets music. She was a violinist, and so she transcribed birdsong, and they're charismatic, lyrical, but really sort of unconscious self-portrait of a woman living by herself in the middle of the country and sort of living with the birds in her garden and house. And I think, that was something that had, I can't even remember how we sort of flagged up in the beginning, but I remember ordering a couple of ancient copies online and reading them and being like, this is absolutely remarkable writing, a really unusual voice and doing something really unusual. And it took, I think, about 5 years to very slowly unpick where the rights had gone. And it ended up being a very happy story. But I mean, we were calling like the office of a real estate agent who may once have employed somebody who was once the lawyer for the author back in 1972. It was like that sort of, did so and so ever work here, and do you have a contact for their son? And
it's
writing
like
letters into the void,
and
you really get it. And then the joy is you track it down, and it turns out that it's Sussex Wildlife Trust, and that all the proceeds from the book, which we've sold to Vintage, which we published this fall, will go to the trust and to support wildlife education. It's just it doesn't always work out that way, but when it does, it's just a sort of great, like, I don't know, it's such a feeling of success. Yeah, and when you've created value, not just financial value, although that as well, especially for something like a kind of a wildlife charity. You created real value out of something that was just really too hard for people to bother with. And actually there's a treasure at the end of it. And that's the best version of that journey. But it doesn't always work. Sometimes we run into dead ends. And I think, it's worth mentioning that it can be really frustrating. And we deal with really old contracts, sometimes in the 1920s or 30s, and, previous traditions of granting publishers film and television rights and trying to untangle that, or of old, copyright assignment where an author has sold off his film rights to some random film company for 50 quid because they needed money to pay the rent, or there was a tax, relief if he assigned rights. And sometimes you run into a contract or like a piece of paperwork and you're like, oh, that's it. I can't go any further. That's just nowhere you can go with it.
You wouldn't believe the things that people prioritized in contracts. It's like, we want to make it extremely clear that we have publishing rights on the moon, if there ever is, a moon colony. However, we're not going to say who has translation rights. It's just, we're just not going to put it in the contract.
No, but we're going to mention translation rights and royalty for them. But then actually there's going to be some other piece of really hazy wording about how, I mean, it's just, and then we'll refer you to clause 18A, which doesn't exist. No, and then actually that entire aspect of the contract with signature actually isn't anymore. So, so you do, it is, and I think because we do a lot of work in media rights, so we do a lot of pitching to producers and writers and directors and actors directly to talk about our books. And, there's this, there are some notable cases where we just think we wish we could do something with this, and we have the perfect actor in mind or the most wonderful thing to do, and you just cannot do anything about it. Like, it's just rights tangled up forever. And we all have those kind of sad stories in our back pocket where we wish we could make, Lawrence Darrell's Alexandria Quartet, but Fox are sitting on the rights. And if anybody from Fox is listening to this, please get in touch. But
we want to speak to you guys.
We want to speak to them. We have ideas. But it's really fun. I think the other part, I don't know where I was going with that, but just to get back to the what do we do during the day, one of the most fun things we do is thinking about our books not just as published books, but as film, television, podcast, theater, the whole range, graphic novel, like all of these pieces.
And all agents are doing that to some extent.
Absolutely.
But we're like, things are unusually centralized with us because if the machinery of an agency would normally have, for a living writer, you have your literary agent, and then you'll have your kind of film and TV agent, and you'll have your translation agent, and you'll deliver your new manuscript, and they'll all read it. So you have this kind of community of professionals around you, each with their distinct specialism, all of whom have read your book. Whereas, because we have 4,500 books, it's usually only us who's read the book.
Exactly. And then we work with a really wonderful network of people, our team. So we use the expertise of our media rights people. We have a brilliant in-house translation agent, in division. We actually get our own person who does translation rights for our list who, and that's, incredibly helpful because then they share our brain as well, and they're really close and part of our work, and an assistant who we couldn't do without. So it's you do need a team to do it. It's not just us, but and then we have then we have colleagues across the company who get involved and advise and work with us. So but it is more central, I think, than other places. Anyways.
And when you've I'm trying to get my head around the kind of the relationships you guys must have with both estates at one side and then publishers at the other. So you're kind of in the middle of this kind of triangle here. But when it comes to the estate side of things, first of all, you've got this book and you think this is a great book that no one's read, or is an estate essentially the same as a client? Do they give instructions the same way that an author would about their work, or edits, or obviously edits is probably the wrong thing.
Yes and no. It really varies. We have some incredibly engaged estates, who might be the partner of the dead writer or their child. We have, some of our writers died in the 1950s, and we might even be onto great-grandchildren. Or over the years, those rights have split so much that there are now 35 beneficiaries who will have a 35th of a say in the book.
And often we have like a trust of some kind or a charity that the author has left their copyrights to. So you can leave your copyright not just to an individual, you can leave it to, the Society of Authors. You can leave it to like Battersea Cats and Dogs Home. And so the value of that, and all of those organizations will have, somebody on the kind of fundraising or a point person to go to. So we work with organizations.
Is it harder to get instructions though sometimes, because of that? Because obviously if it's a living author, then you can go direct to them and they will tell you immediately what they think, whereas I imagine, especially if you're dealing with rights that maybe are vested in an organization or something, it might take a bit longer to
we're really lucky. I remember when I started at the job a long time ago now. Not talk about how long that was. But I think what I saw was, there was a brilliant woman who did part of this job ahead before we did. There was somebody looking after our literary estates at Curtis Brown. She had like 3 full-time jobs, trying to do all of them in one woman. She did it brilliantly, but there were a lot of people that she didn't quite have time to kind of like solidify relationships with because she had too much to do. And so when I started, I took over from her, and I think that for the first year I basically just spent calling people and having coffee with people, with our clients, with the literary estate clients, and explaining who we were and what we did and what it meant to be part of an agency. Because I think a lot of people don't really understand your grandson, a writer's grandchild, or even partner, or a charity, they are not necessarily publishing savvy. And so there's a lot of communication and education that goes around how to do it. And I think we've done a pretty good job at helping our clients be engaged and reactive and supportive and make decisions. And they're also, but also a lot of people, it's both a huge honor and a huge burden to be the person responsible for a father or a partner's work. And, I think sometimes we think we do quite a lot of parochial care around that as well. Sort of like, really, it's quite complex, serious, emotional discussions about how people feel about it. And I think, if we do try very hard to help people make sense of the decisions that need to be made and why we're doing things. And I hope we do that successfully.
It's one of our clients put it really nicely when she said that, she has two hats. She has her literary executor hat and she has her widow hat. And often the person wearing those two hats has a really polarized opinion on what the right thing to do is. The widow wants to keep everything sacrosanct and hers, and the literary executor knows that she has a responsibility to make sure that this legacy grows and that this writer isn't forgotten. And I think, it can be, I think all good writing is inherently emotional. Like if you're looking after a living writer, like, even if they're writing the most kind of, sort of commercial sort of 2 book a year fiction, like it comes from somewhere. Like nobody's just generating work.
And people's families can take the brunt of that, there's deadlines and the life, I think we went to the Nibbies last night and so many of the speeches from people who were being awarded were like, thank you to my kids who did not deserve having a mom who was on deadline every single hour of the day. And, like a partner who, has lived with like this bookshop in his life for 20, it was a lot of like the fact that and a writer, their family has to live with their books and their writing process. And it's not a straightforward process. Any creative act is complicated and the people can be complicated actually.
And the emotional legacy
and celebrity, because actually there's we're talking about celebrity as well. So we see the kind of not fallout, it can be positive and negative fallout from a writer's life. And we're kind of, coming in behind to sort of not picking up the pieces, but sort of positively picking up the pieces and trying to help people make sense of that responsibility and what the potential is, and also protecting people. We do a lot of, of sort of safeguarding, protecting, and making sure that people aren't feeling exposed, because it can be really exposing and quite public sometimes to speak about your life. And it's not straightforward for people.
No. Is it something that authors should think about, while they're alive? What's going to happen to my rights after I die?
I think coming into this conversation, because I know this is quite a writer-focused podcast in a lot of ways, I really wanted to make sure that we had a chance to say to the writers out there that it is never too soon to start thinking about, once you have a body of work, what happens to it after you die, and who is going to be left with it, and is that the right person, and are they comfortable with that, and are there anything you want to, kind of put in place to kind of protect your legacy or to protect the people who might be responsible for it? Conversations about that, making a really clear will that it lays out what you want to happen and who should be responsible. Really, really helpful.
It can be absolutely heartbreaking sometimes to, be investigating a writer and to look at what is stipulated in their will and to find out they haven't mentioned their copyrights. And if you don't specifically assign your copyright in your will, it's infinitely divisible. So if you have 100 beneficiaries and you don't give one of them your copyright, they all get 100 of your copyright. And the number of times that we've come across bodies of work that are almost unrepresentable, unpublishable, because
there's so many
no
people
one
involved.
can wrangle 35 different charities into engaging with a £1,500
and also just thinking about, that is absolutely true. And then also just thinking about, actually, is there somebody in your life who is particularly interested in your work, and you can, and who you can imagine for another 50 years after you die continuing to be interested in your work? And because actually the best representation we can do is we do with the literary estates, with the families who are engaged and who are thinking creatively about their relative or the person whose work they're responsible for, who are actively engaged, who are thinking into it. And it doesn't have to be that way, and we can do great work. That book and those books can be successful without that. But I think if you're thinking about it as a writer and you think, I'd really love my work to, actually I'd be grateful for these people to be responsible, or to have just a clear chat with your with your family about what the about what that means. I think it's really important.
And I suppose it's one thing if you were you know, if you were like Stephen King or someone who was massive and had an obvious value, and you knew you had this legacy and all these books you wanted to make sure you were taken care of after you died, that's probably an obvious person who would think that man needs to have stuff in his will. But then I suppose the flip side is authors who maybe aren't massive or who only become big after the death and have never thought my writing is of worth, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think all art has value, and even if, I mean, look, not everybody's going to be Stephen King, and no, their books may not sell 1 billion copies, you know, for the next 70 years until the end of copyright. But I think there's you don't know where the value is going to go, and you know, you can't predict that what might have slightly fallen by the wayside or fallen between the cracks in 1959 actually, in, like you said, in, you know, 2024 might suddenly come up again, and somebody might dig it out of a pile and say, God, this book should have been made a movie, and there it goes. So you just don't know, and maybe nothing happens, and that's okay.
I think as well, like, even if you kind of don't what if about it at all, like the thing that we always say is that, you know, copyright persists for 70 years after you die. So unless you live to 100 and started writing at 30, you are going to spend more time as an estate than you are going to as a living writer. And I think it's always quite surprising just how little thought. And I mean, it's fair, isn't it? I mean, not many people want to think about their demise, us included, I think. But
it's true. Like, people don't like talking about wills and all that sort of stuff generally. So this is another thing.
And I think we see that, you know, and also the other thing to say is that, you know, when you die, and hopefully at a ripe old age with a you know, a love around you. But I think there is also a moment of transition. So, you know, if you die and everybody's kind of scrambling around thinking, oh God, we haven't thought about this for a while. We haven't, especially since authors often live really long lives, like many other people. And actually in your, you know, maybe the last 10 years, you've not been very active. And then suddenly there's a kind of flurry of that, you know, it's all kind of sort of been gone quiet, and then you die and there's a flurry. You know, is there somebody who's going to be the person who gives a quote to the obituary or writes the obituary? I mean, you don't have to think about it that detail, but it's really helpful when a family is grieving to have a safe pair of hands. And I think, you know, like when somebody dies, people are in grief, in shock, in anger, whatever the emotion, you know, they want somebody to manage an outpouring. If it's a famous writer, you know, they're I think having a safe pair of hands to help guide that process. Suddenly they're going to be people who want to do features or republish the books, and people can really be quite taken aback because they're not quite prepared for that conversation. They don't really understand it. And I think for a writer to give their families or their friends the grace to deal with that moment, especially, is helpful. Anyways,
it strikes me as well, one person that might be that person in a lot of writers' cases would be their agent, perhaps. So, I mean, do you deal with other literary agents a lot?
Yeah, I mean, we've been. There are not many people who do what we do. I think I think you can count on one hand the number of literary estate specialist agents in the world, and we're the only people where there's more than one of us. And, you know, so we end up kind of giving talks on this kind of thing, and just sort of being often moral support for, you know, for people who are going through, like, I think particularly, you know, most agents will end up with an estate client, you know, sometimes in quite shocking or unexpected circumstances. And it's really hard to know what to do. You know, you do have as the agent of living writers, you have this person, you know, you're part of a team with that person. And one half of the team falls away. And I think it can sometimes, particularly for younger agents, be very, very difficult to know what to do.
And also because, you know, agents who represent living writers, it's not just a business relationship, it's a friendship. It's the, like I said, the first person who's read your books is really close, you're really close. And so the agent is also, like, you know, trying to deal with their loss. Grief. And it can get complicated, as it always does. But I think I also think it's interesting because it's not always the writer that represented them in their life is not necessarily the agent that represented the writer in their life. You know, as time goes on after an author's death, that might not be the right agent any longer. And so, because representing backlist and the whole of a writer, and it's different editors you speak to quite often. There's different strategies. There's a different pace. There's a different structure to a day. There's a different seasonal kind of move. Like it is just a different business than representing living writers. And I think what we really loved about working with our colleagues here is that we can do a lot of co-agenting with people who are maybe, kind of thinking about, they agent that writer during their life. They still have a very close connection to the family or to the work. But then, we often do a lot of work with our colleagues on those estates, which are kind of in that space between recent enough that agent is still involved to sort of transitioning to what, to having the skills to sort of take those books into the next stage. And I think, always happy to talk to people, even at other agencies, about how to manage it, and if there's advice, or if there's, it's just really, I think there is a different business. And I think the more kind of like,
I think as well, sometimes a distinction, and we have both over the years spent a lot of time working with, like developing writers, with, sort of new writing and talking to people who don't yet have an agent. And there's this kind of perception of like, right, yes, I need an agent. I need an agent. That is, step 2, like step 1, write a book. Step 2, find an agent. Step 3, find a publisher.
Yeah.
And actually, an agent isn't a stepping stone to a publisher. Like you're looking for someone who can be your kind of, who can kind of translate that world for you, who knows the right people, who knows how to handle your specific work, your specific career. Yeah. I think what we do is incredibly specialist, and it is, and these books do need treating in a very specific way. And I feel like the longer we do it, the greater an understanding we have of actually how different this job is to other agents.
We had Curtis Brown's own Johnny Geller on just the other week there, and he was saying when he was representing John le Carré said to him, "You're my voice in the room. You're him." So it is, as you say, it's a special kind of relationship, an agent, and I think, as you say, it's not just a stepping stone, and obviously for estates as well, it's going to be a very important role as well. We are going to have to wrap up soon, but I did want to touch on what happened last night. At the time of recording, you were both awarded Literary Agent of the Year at
Should I pull it forward?
Yes, let's see the award.
Everybody could admire it. But I think that's, yes, we won the Nibby.
Yes.
Agents of the Year.
Agents of the Year.
And I think what we failed to say utterly in our enormously shambling but hopefully charming speech was that that I think in the last 10 years, what has been so heartening and so brilliant, and which I think is why it felt like such a lovely and right time to do it, is that there has been this wonderful community of backlist publishers and agents and editors and readers and bookshop and booksellers have all kind of coalesced around the idea of reading into past decades, of celebrating older books in new formats and ways. And I think it felt like a win, not for Becky and for me. Obviously we were immensely proud and chuffed and drank champagne, because you do, but it's actually felt like that's never been acknowledged. That role of an agent in that world has never been acknowledged at the Nibbies before, and I think it is a real celebration for backlist as a whole. I think it's a win for literary estates and a win for backlist and the whole community around them.
Yeah, I mean, we were the first agents to win Agent of the Year for working with estates. Yes. In fact, I think we're probably also the first agents to even ever be nominated for working with estates. So it does feel like really, actually, like not overdue for us, but overdue
for the industry
more broadly. Because I think for a very long time there was this kind of idea that classics sustain themselves. So classics were acknowledged as classics within their lifetime and therefore persisted. They were on the curriculum, they were published by Penguin, and there they were, and they were this kind of finite thing.
And there was one kind of, it was a classic, was a classic. And then that didn't bear challenging.
And everything else fell away. And I think we're at a really interesting point of kind of reassessing, actually, okay, e.g., why is the canon so male? Like, we have some extraordinarily brilliant female writers who in their lifetimes were dismissed as kind of writing for women, as writing domestic fiction, whereas you look at it now and it's brilliant literary fiction. It's like, if they were a man, it would have been called brilliant literary fiction. And, there is an element of kind of reassessment and redress to what we do that's really, heartening.
No, I think so.
I think,
yeah.
And yeah,
and also just expanding the idea. I think when we first kind of created what we do now at Curtis Brown Heritage, we had, there was always that kind of Curtis Brown classics, like that's just, there's a, a consonance that sounds good. And we fought really hard to call it, well, to a receptive audience, to call it heritage, because I think we see what we do and what everybody in the backlist sort of literary estates world does is actually trying to celebrate and give access to readers for our sort of shared cultural heritage. And that is a much more diverse and interesting place to be if you don't just kind of leave it at classics and let it sustain itself. And it feels like, and I'm actually not sure. I mean, it's overdue, but it's also, I'm not sure it could have happened until till now, because there is a community that is stronger than it's ever been, a sense of that kind of embracing of and diversification and kind of engagement in backlist and in classics. And I think that's why it felt like this was a really nice moment to do it. It felt like the industry as a whole had earned this.
So looking forward, then, do you see a future in the next 5-10 years where heritage books from estates are only become larger and larger, but we'll get more and more readers experiencing or being exposed to books by authors they'd never heard of, or books they didn't know their authors had written? Is that going to become bigger?
If we keep on doing our jobs, right?
Theoretically. I think, for the last few years, there have been at least a couple of books each year, usually in the summer, that are kind of really, the kind of reissue that instead of selling the sort of standard sort of 1,000 to 3,000 copies, will sell 30,000 copies. And I think that's going to stay a real sort of fixture of the kind of the calendar. I think there will always be some creative agent and editor pulling something astonishing out of somewhere. We get asked all the time, like, what happens when you run out of books? And actually, I mean, it's never been a worry. It's never been a worry. Well, also because
the human lifespan is really only kind of like, it's quite limited. So
yes, so people do keep dying, and then we do keep representing. but also. But also what we're interested in changes, and we have in the 8 long years we've been doing this, watched kind of a shift in, I would say, away from kind of quite sort of comfortable, so I would say quite sort of vintagey feeling fiction, in the sense of, sort of tea dresses and World War II, shift into a kind of a less comfortable, more claustrophobic interest in the kind of fiction of the 60s and 70s. And, I think as the years march on and things, I don't know, it's like, all the kids wearing their 90s clothes now.
The paste wheel turns.
And
we're just trying to ride it,
exactly. The wheel spins.
And
we're just watching it and occasionally intervening.
Yeah, and what's amazing is that writers, I was thinking about Iris Murdoch again, because there was a writer who was writing through the kind of like 50s, 60s, 70s, and writing way ahead of her time and into a future. I mean, and she was, writing queer fiction and really kind of like, I don't know, complex, binary, interesting sort of like fiction that speaks to now and to our kind of understanding now. And reading her then, you would have felt like, what is she doing? What even is this? It's quite transgressive. And now reading it, it feels like fresh air and kind of keen consciousness and philosophies that we would feel very comfortable with now. And it feels like that's the joy, is like writers are almost always writing way into the future and ahead of their time. The good ones are. And so we get to go and kind of almost read them in their time, because that's that time is now.
That's such a nice way.
Thanks, man. Yeah. There's a speech we should do in the news last night.
That's been great. But we always like to wrap up every podcast by asking our guests the same questions. So very quickly, what was the last book that you both read? It doesn't have to be from a deceased author. It can be from a living
Almost
one.
always is.
Yeah, sadly, I don't actually know the last time I read something by a living writer. I wish that were a joke. It's not. I was on holiday last week and I read Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier.
Oh, nice.
That's fantastic. Well, I have two, and one is living and one is not. And the one I'm in the middle of reading, just finishing, is a book by a writer called B. Bandele, who sadly died a year and a half ago or so, but has his last novel, or his sort of the latest novel, coming out in the summer with Hamish Hamilton. But the one I read was one of his backlists called Burma Boy, and it's an incredible story about a Nigerian kid. I mean, it's 13 years old, who ends up in the Second World War, ends up in the Chindits in Burma, and in the army, and on the long walk, and the world he finds himself in. And it's based on sort of stories from B's own grandfather, and also just a kind of wild and brilliant, immersive, funny and heart-wrenching story of a child at war, which is absolutely excellent. And then also because I have both very highfalutin literary taste, but also love romantasy. I spent a wonderful week ill in bed with the flu a couple of weeks ago, and read everything by Kirsten Kishore, starting with Graceling, and would highly recommend the Graceling books and all of those as a kind of just like glorious, deep hot bath of romantasy. I loved them. So
Brilliant.
There you
Brilliant. What about the last film that you guys watched?
go. Great question. What have I seen recently? Well, I'm going to be really predictable and say that actually it wasn't the last one I've watched. We've been watching Shogun, which is really fun.
Oh,
I'm trying to I live with a husband who is obsessed with war movies. So when I watch films, it tends to be his choice. So we have watched a number of those recently. But I must say that the most fun viewing experience of the last year has been watching every single episode of Slow Horses available to me.
Oh yeah, it's
brilliant. I literally, they are the most fun, inventive, thoughtful, funny English delight, and the books are some of my favorite. And honestly, like, watching them become just as brilliant in television was a joy, because we're huge Mick Herron fans. And
yeah, we mobbed him at the Nibbies last night.
Yeah.
We were very excited to see him.
But the TV is incredible, and it's just one of those lovely moments where they did it justice. And I hope he feels that way too, because I love them.
Yeah, I actually don't know the last time I watched the film. Fair. I'm very busy reading.
Fair enough. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UK Page 1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.